So in the last movie, we took a look at basic numbers, and we're familiar with what numbers are. They're things like 3 and 4. But now we're going to take a look at floating point numbers, or as they're sometimes just referred to as floats. So before we do, let's make one last change to our numbers file here, which is just to put a colon at the top and make it integers, because that's actually the kind of numbers that we were working with there. But there are two types of numbers. So we're going to make another one after we save this file. We'll save it in the numbers.php. Then we'll do a save as, and this one's going to be called floats.php. And instead of integers then in this one, I'm going to call it floats or floating point numbers. And I'm going to go ahead and clear all of this out of there. Now, it might be tempting to think of them as being the same type because they're so similar. And we can think of an expression like PHP var1 equals, and we'll just say 3.14. And you may think, well, that's just a number. But it's not. And they're treated a little bit differently in PHP. And we can actually ask PHP, is this number a floating point or is it not? And we'll work on that later on. But for now, you need to know that they are two distinct types, integers and floating point numbers. And the way to be certain which one you're working with visually is to look for the decimal point. Now, you can, of course, get to a floating point by doing something very simple like PHP echo 4 divided by 3. And of course, we know that's going to give us a result if we load up our browser and we go to floats of 1.333. That is a floating point number. It will happily move between floating points and integers, but there is a difference, and we just want to keep that in mind as we're working, that there is always a difference between these. I'm going to go ahead and paste in some functions that we can use if we're working with floating points. So the first thing I've got is a floating point, which I've said just echo the value of my float, which is going to be set equal to 3.14. The next couple of functions are going to work with that value. The first is going to echo back the rounding of that, and we're going to round it to 1 decimal place. Then we can take the ceiling or the floor of that floating point, which says either round up or round down. Now, round, the first one, is going to work according to the rounding rules that we're used to. With a 5, it rounds up. With a 4 or less, it rounds down. Ceiling and floor are going to force it to always round up to the highest number or always down to the lowest. One thing you just want to make sure you keep in mind is that ceiling is not C-E-I-L-I-N-G as the function name. It's C-E-I-L, whereas floor is what you would expect. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to save this, and I'll just jump back over to my browser and reload it, and you'll see that sure enough, it tells me my floating point was set to 3.14. It rounded it to 1 decimal place, which was 3.1. The ceiling, of course, of that would be 4 because it rounded up, and floor would be 3. So you can see now how we can start to work with floats. Now, there are a lot of other math functions, and I'm not going to go into all of them. You can go onto php.net and look up the ones you need when you need them, but I'm just going to show you a couple more, and you can try them on your own if you want. There's absolute value, which is ABS, and that will take the absolute value of something, give you the positive number if it's a negative number. So I've created 0 minus 300, which of course will give us negative 300, and then it'll turn that into a positive value. We can take the exponential expression, which is pow for power, so 2 to the 8th power. Square root will give us the square root of a number. And the next one's going to be modulo. And maybe modulo is not a common word that you're used to, but it's actually the remainder that's left once a division is performed. So in this case, we're taking 20 and dividing it by 7, and we're not interested in the result of what comes back. We're interested in the remainder that would have been left. So for example, 7 times 2 would be 14, and there would be 6 more left as the remainder to get to 20. Now if it had been 21, then the modulo would be 0 because it divides evenly. And random will give you back a random number, and you can read the documentations for all the details about how random that number is, but it's going to be random enough for most of your purposes. Or random between a minimum and a maximum number. So these are a few more that you can try on your own. There are a lot more that you can use depending on what application. Sine, cosine, and a lot more advanced mathematics. But the key thing you need to understand here is that we can work with numbers, we can work with strings, we can assign them to variables, and that gives us a sort of clay that we can work with as we can start to sculpt our application. Now that we have those basics down, And we're ready to move on to a more complex programming concept that's going to be also very helpful to us called arrays, and we'll do that in the next movie.